The night the insult was spoken, Harrington House glittered as though determined to blind itself to its own cruelty. Crystal chandeliers trembled with light above a tide of silk and satin. The marble floors reflected the movement of gowns like water disturbed by swans. It was a winter ball arranged less for pleasure than for display, a ritual by which rank reassured itself of permanence. And yet, beneath the music and measured laughter, something sharper moved, an appetite for judgment, a hunger for spectacle. Miss Eliza Fairley stood near the far wall, precisely where a woman of her position was expected to stand. Neither guest nor servant, she occupied the narrow territory society reserved for dependents of good breeding and insufficient fortune. Her dress was modest, well cut but unadorned, the color chosen for discretion rather than admiration. She held herself with a composure learned through necessity, the sort of poise that comes not from confidence but from vigilance. Every smile offered her way felt provisional. Every glance lingered half a second too long. They spoke of her in murmurs, as if she were a portrait whose provenance invited speculation. Some called her accomplished, others merely tolerable. A few, more careless, referred to her usefulness. Eliza heard nothing directly, yet she felt the pressure of those voices as one feels weather changing. An ache in the bones, a warning carried on air. When the Duke of Ashcombe entered the ballroom, conversation bent toward him as iron bends to a magnet. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed with an austerity that only increased his authority. The lines of his face suggested discipline rather than warmth. His eyes, dark and assessing, bore the stillness of someone long accustomed to command. He moved through the room with practiced economy, acknowledging greetings without indulgence, as though society were a duty he discharged rather than a pleasure he enjoyed. Eliza had known the Duke for nearly a year, long enough to understand the boundaries he enforced. She served as companion and reader to his widowed aunt, a role that granted her shelter but no true belonging. In private, he addressed her with courtesy so precise it bordered on distance. In public, she was scarcely addressed at all. He did not look at her now as he crossed the room, and yet she felt his presence with an unwelcome clarity, as though some invisible thread bound her awareness to his movements. The insult arrived not as a shout but as a remark delivered with careless assurance. A young baronet, flushed with wine and confidence, had questioned the necessity of retaining such arrangements within a noble household. His tone was light, almost playful, but the implication was plain. Eliza sensed the shift before the words reached her, the subtle drawing in of breath among those nearest. The Duke replied without hesitation. "I can hire 50 like her," he said, his voice steady, audible enough to travel beyond the circle of gentlemen who had paused beside him. "Competence is not a rarity." The words fell into the room with the weight of something final. For a moment, the violins faltered, as if even the musicians sensed the disturbance. Eliza did not turn. She felt heat rise to her face, then recede, leaving behind a cold clarity that steadied her spine. The remark had stripped her of name and history, reduced her to function. In that instant she understood precisely how the Duke saw her. Not as a woman shaped by experience and will, but as a convenience easily replaced. What followed was worse for being subtle. Averted eyes. A cough too loudly cleared. The swift resumption of conversation by those eager to demonstrate indifference. No one spoke to Eliza. No one offered the mercy of acknowledgment. She was left standing within the circle of light, newly visible in her disgrace. At last, she turned and met the Duke's gaze. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed his expression, surprise perhaps or annoyance at being confronted by consequence. He inclined his head in a gesture that might have been apology had it not been so restrained. Eliza returned the inclination with a courtesy perfected through years of restraint, then stepped away. She moved through the crowd without haste, each step measured, each breath controlled. Her departure did not halt the ball. It did not need to. The injury inflicted was quiet, designed to leave no mark upon the offender. Yet as she passed into the antechamber and the door closed behind her, the sound of laughter on the other side seemed suddenly coarse, as though the room itself had revealed its true nature. The corridor beyond was dim and cool, lit by a single lamp that cast elongated shadows upon the walls. Eliza paused there, allowing herself the luxury of stillness. She did not cry. Tears, she knew, would change nothing. Instead, she considered the arithmetic of her life as it had been presented to her that evening. Usefulness weighed against dignity, security purchased with silence. She thought of the Duke as she had first encountered him, a man rigid with duty, carrying grief like armor. She had admired his steadiness then, mistaking it for fairness. Tonight had corrected that illusion. He was not cruel by temperament. He was indifferent by design. To him, power was simply the order of things. Eliza drew a slow breath and straightened. If she remained, she would accept the terms spoken aloud in that ballroom. If she left, she would step into uncertainty with nothing but her name and the education she had fought to secure. The choice frightened her. It also clarified her resolve. Beyond the walls of Harrington House, carriages waited beneath a sky heavy with cloud, their lamps glowing like small, stubborn stars. Eliza returned to the ballroom only long enough to collect her cloak, her expression serene, her movements unremarkable. She did not seek the Duke's attention again. That, she knew, would come soon enough. As she stepped into the night air, the music behind her swelled, ignorant of what it had set in motion. Eliza closed the carriage door herself and gave the address of her modest lodgings, her voice steady. The wheels began to turn, carrying her away from a house that had offered shelter but demanded erasure. Inside, the Duke lingered near the fireplace, his gaze drawn, against his will, to the place where she had stood. He felt dimly the disturbance he had caused, though he could not yet name it. He told himself the matter was settled, that order had been restored. The certainty rang hollow even to his own ears. Outside, the carriage disappeared into the darkness, and with it went the assumption that some people were infinitely replaceable. The night closed over the street, holding its secrets close, while somewhere between fear and resolve, Eliza Fairley made a decision that would not be undone. In the days that followed the ball, Harrington House continued its rituals with outward calm, yet beneath the polished surfaces something had shifted. Servants spoke more softly, as though aware that walls remembered words. Guests came and went, remarking upon the elegance of the season, but the absence of one quiet figure was noted with a curiosity that bordered on satisfaction. Miss Fairley's place beside the Duke's aunt remained empty, her chair untouched, her embroidery frame set aside as if she might return at any moment. She did not. Eliza Fairley, for her part, discovered that departure did not grant immediate peace. Her lodgings were clean but spare, the rooms warmed by a fire that demanded constant attention. Each morning she rose early, not from habit alone but from a need to assert purpose where uncertainty threatened to seep in. She sent letters to former acquaintances, inquiring after positions that valued discretion and learning, and waited for replies that did not arrive with the urgency she had hoped for. Freedom, she learned, was not generous. It required patience and courage renewed daily. The Duke learned of her absence through his aunt, who spoke of it with mild confusion rather than alarm. He replied with assurances that arrangements would be made, that suitable replacements could be found. The words sounded familiar even as they left his mouth, and he disliked that familiarity. Later that afternoon, passing through the library, he noticed the faint scent of lavender lingering among the shelves where Eliza had so often read aloud. The discovery irritated him more than it should have done. Within the week, gossip found its voice. It was suggested, in drawing rooms and over tea, that Miss Fairley had departed in disgrace, that her sensibilities had been unequal to the demands of her position. Others hinted at impropriety, at expectations misunderstood. The stories were inconsistent, but they shared a single purpose: to explain her disappearance without examining its cause. Eliza heard fragments of these rumors when she ventured out, delivered with polite sympathy or thinly veiled satisfaction. She met them with silence, refusing to defend herself against accusations that shifted like smoke. The Duke, however, was not content to let the matter dissolve. One evening, he dictated a letter in which he praised Eliza's competence and offered a generous sum for her immediate return. The language was formal, almost impersonal, as though he were negotiating the retrieval of property rather than the restoration of trust. He sealed the letter with decisive pressure, then paused, staring at the wax as it cooled. Something in the gesture felt inadequate. He added a second note, shorter, expressing regret for any offense given, though the words remained careful, avoiding admission. Both were dispatched the following morning. Eliza received the letters together, their combined weight more burdensome than either alone. She read them once, then again, considering not only what was written but what was conspicuously absent. There was no acknowledgment of the humiliation she had endured, no recognition of her as anything beyond an efficient solution to an inconvenience. She folded the pages neatly and set them aside. When she replied, her hand did not tremble. She thanked the Duke for his consideration and declined his offer, citing the need to seek employment more suited to her circumstances. The refusal was composed with impeccable courtesy, its restraint sharper than reproach. The reply unsettled him. He read it twice, then a third time, as though searching for a hidden concession. Finding none, he felt a stirring of irritation that quickly gave way to something less familiar: doubt. He had assumed compliance, as he had so often assumed it before. The assumption now appeared flawed. Determined to reassert order, the Duke sent a gift, a small parcel containing a volume of poetry she had once admired, bound in fine leather. It was accompanied by a brief note, and signed but unmistakably his, offering the book as a gesture of goodwill. Eliza accepted the parcel, appreciating the thought even as she recognized its implication. The gift suggested familiarity without accountability, affection without humility. She sent it back the following day, enclosed with a single sentence expressing her belief that such tokens were best reserved for friends. The return of the book caused comment. A servant mentioned it in passing. A cousin raised an eyebrow at dinner. The Duke said nothing, but the action lodged in his mind with uncomfortable persistence. For the first time, he sensed that Eliza's refusal was not petulance but principle. As the weeks passed, the tension found a public expression. At a small gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, Eliza appeared unexpectedly, invited on the strength of her intellect rather than her connections. She entered the room with quiet confidence, her attire modest but chosen with care. Conversations faltered, then resumed with renewed interest. When the Duke arrived later that evening, their eyes met across the room, and the air between them tightened, charged with unspoken history. A careless remark was made by another guest, implying that Eliza's fortunes had declined. Before she could respond, the Duke spoke, his tone measured yet unmistakably protective. He corrected the assumption, praising her abilities in terms that drew attention rather than diffused it. The room fell silent, aware that something private had been revealed too openly. Eliza felt the weight of the moment keenly. Gratitude warred with resentment, and she resented that conflict most of all. When the evening ended, whispers followed her departure, speculation ignited by the Duke's intervention. By morning, the incident had been embroidered into scandal, casting their association in a light neither had intended. The Duke recognized his error almost at once. His defense had been another form of control, assuming authority where none had been granted. Eliza, hearing of the renewed gossip, understood that distance alone would not protect her from misinterpretation. The tokens offered and returned, the words spoken and overheard, had bound their reputations together more tightly than proximity ever had. One evening, as rain traced slow paths down the windows of her lodgings, Eliza received a final note from the Duke. This one bore no offer, no gift, only a request, that she grant him a conversation, private and unobserved, so that misunderstandings might be addressed. The simplicity of the appeal struck her more deeply than any earlier overture. She set the note beside the fire and watched its edges curl slightly in the heat, considering the cost of refusal and the risk of acquiescence. Across the city, the Duke stood alone in his study, the fire burning low, aware that for once his will was not enough. The next move belonged to her, and the waiting tested him more than he cared to admit. Somewhere between obligation and desire, both stood poised at the edge of a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The room the Duke chose for their meeting was neither grand nor intimate, but something suspended between the two. It lay at the rear of his townhouse, a withdrawing room seldom used except for solitary reading, its windows overlooking a narrow garden stripped bare by winter. Rain pressed steadily against the glass, muting the city beyond into a low, persistent hush. A single lamp burned beside the hearth, casting a circle of light that refused to reach the corners, as though even the shadows wished to listen without being seen. Eliza arrived precisely on the hour. She did not look about her when she entered, nor did she wait to be invited forward. She removed her gloves with deliberate care, folded them once, and held them loosely in her hands. Her composure was intact, but it was no longer the guarded stillness of endurance. It was something firmer, shaped by decision. The Duke rose when she entered, not from courtesy alone but from an instinct he did not recognize until it had already moved him. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was weighted, expectant, as though words must prove themselves worthy before being released. "I thank you for agreeing to see me," he said at last. His voice was steady, yet quieter than she remembered. "I will not detain you longer than necessary." "That will depend upon what is said," Eliza replied. Her tone was calm, neither conciliatory nor hostile, and that neutrality unsettled him more than reproach would have done. He gestured toward a chair, then checked himself, allowing her to choose whether to sit or remain standing. She took the chair nearest the fire, not for comfort but for clarity, and he seated himself opposite her, leaving a measured distance between them. The space felt deliberate, a boundary neither had yet decided how to cross. He began as he always had, with reason. He spoke of misunderstandings, of the imprecision of words spoken in public, of intentions that had been misconstrued. As he spoke, Eliza listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The more carefully he framed his explanation, the more acutely he felt its insufficiency. When he finished, she did not respond at once. She looked instead at the fire, watching the flame catch and release the edge of a log, as if studying the nature of persistence. When she spoke, it was not to rebut his points but to redirect them entirely. "You have explained why you did not mean to wound me," she said. "You have not explained why it did not occur to you that you might." The simplicity of the statement left no room for evasion. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struck by the accuracy of her observation. She continued, her voice gaining strength not through volume but through precision. "I have lived my life under the careful governance of other people's comfort," she said. "I have learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to make myself agreeable without being seen. I do not resent the necessity of work, nor do I mistake independence for ease. But I will not accept erasure as the price of shelter." He watched her as though seeing her fully for the first time, not as a presence defined by utility but as a will sharpened by experience. She spoke of the years spent acquiring knowledge deemed decorative rather than essential, of positions offered with condescension disguised as kindness, of gratitude expected for considerations that cost their givers nothing. Each sentence was measured, restrained, yet carried the weight of long endurance. "When you spoke of me as replaceable," she said quietly, "you did not merely insult me. You confirmed every fear I have ever had about the fragility of my standing. You reminded me how easily dignity is mistaken for indulgence when it belongs to a woman without fortune." The Duke felt the words land with undeniable force. He had faced accusation before, formal charges, political opposition, the censure of equals, but this was different. There was no advantage to be gained from denying her account, no strategy that could diminish its truth. He found himself searching for language that did not rely on authority. "I was wrong," he said, the admission emerging with unexpected difficulty, not in expression alone but in understanding. "I believed myself just because I was not deliberately cruel. I see now how narrow that belief was." She regarded him closely, as though assessing whether the acknowledgment was offered freely or merely as a means to an end. Encouraged by her attention, he spoke again, this time without rehearsal. "I have lived within structures that affirm me at every turn," he continued. "I have rarely been required to consider the cost of that affirmation to others. Loss taught me discipline, not humility. Perhaps I mistook the one for the other." The confession surprised him as much as it did her. It was not an absolution he sought but an understanding he had long neglected. Eliza's expression softened slightly, not in forgiveness but in recognition of sincerity. "I did not come here to be restored to my former position," she said, "nor to be compensated for what has passed. I came because silence would have made me complicit in my own diminishment." He nodded, accepting the boundary she drew. The fire crackled softly between them, its warmth an uninvited witness to the exchange. Outside, the rain intensified, tapping insistently against the windows as though urging resolution. "There is one thing more," Eliza said, her voice steady but edged with resolve. "You asked for this meeting. I granted it. But I will not accept further overtures framed as favors. If we are to speak again, it must be as equals or not at all." The clarity of her condition left him no room to retreat into habit. He saw, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, how much he stood to lose if he failed to meet her on those terms. More unsettling still was the realization that he did not wish to lose it. "I understand," he said, though the word felt provisional, as though understanding were an action rather than a state. "And I will abide by it." Eliza rose, reclaiming her gloves, her posture composed but no longer guarded. The conversation had not resolved the tension between them. It had merely stripped it of illusion. As she moved toward the door, he spoke her name, the sound of it unadorned by title or expectation. She paused, turning back just enough to acknowledge him. The moment held, suspended between what had been confessed and what remained unsaid. Then she inclined her head once, not in submission but in recognition, and left the room. The door closed softly behind her. The Duke remained seated, the echo of her words settling into the quiet like embers refusing to die. For the first time in his life, authority offered him no comfort. What lay ahead would require something far rarer than command, and he suspected, with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, that the reckoning had only begun. Winter loosened its grip reluctantly, as though unwilling to relinquish the lessons it had imposed. In the weeks following their conversation, the Duke altered nothing that could be observed at a distance. He attended his obligations, presided over dinners, and conducted his affairs with the same measured authority that had long defined him. Yet beneath that composed exterior, an unfamiliar discipline took hold, restraint. He wrote no letters he could not justify to himself. He offered no gestures that assumed acceptance. For the first time, he allowed absence to remain unanswered, trusting that patience might prove more persuasive than power. Eliza felt the change without seeing its source. Her days settled into a demanding rhythm, shaped by modest employment secured through merit rather than patronage. The work required concentration and offered little glamour, but it afforded her something she had long been denied, the dignity of clear terms. She slept better, rose with purpose, and carried herself with an ease born not of security but of self-respect. Still, there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when memory intruded, bringing with it the unresolved weight of what had passed between her and the Duke. They encountered one another again not by design but by circumstance. A charitable assembly, convened to address the needs of displaced families, drew together individuals of varied rank under the pretense of common cause. Eliza attended at the invitation of a colleague who valued her discernment. The Duke arrived as a matter of expectation. When they found themselves in the same room, the recognition was immediate and unembellished, stripped of surprise or evasion. This time, he did not approach her first. He observed instead, noting how she spoke with assurance, how others listened without condescension. The realization unsettled him more than any refusal had done. When at last their paths crossed, his greeting was simple, devoid of the careful flourishes that once signaled superiority. She returned it with equal simplicity, the exchange marked by a civility that neither concealed nor exaggerated their history. They spoke briefly of the work at hand, of practical matters requiring cooperation rather than persuasion. The conversation revealed an ease that had been impossible before, born of mutual recognition rather than obligation. When they parted, there was no promise made, no expectation set. Yet the restraint itself felt significant, a tacit acknowledgement that something had changed irrevocably. The Duke carried that recognition with him into solitude. In the quiet of his study, he confronted the habits that had shaped his conduct, the reflex to command, the assumption that affection could be summoned through provision. He understood now that the authority he wielded so fluently had shielded him from vulnerability, allowing him to mistake control for care. Eliza had not merely resisted that error, she had exposed it. When he wrote to her again, it was not to propose or persuade. He wrote to ask whether she would consent to his company on a walk through the public gardens, nothing more. The request was modest by design, its sincerity unarmored. He sealed the letter without flourish and waited. Eliza read the note with careful attention. She recognized the difference immediately, not in the wording alone but in the absence of expectation. The choice was hers, unencumbered by implication. She accepted, not as concession but as consideration, aware that whatever followed would be shaped by the terms she had set. They walked beneath bare branches just beginning to show signs of renewal, the path softened by recent rain. Conversation unfolded gradually, neither forced nor evasive. They spoke of books, of the obligations that constrained them, of the ways in which lives diverged despite shared ground. The Duke listened more than he spoke, absorbing not only her words but the confidence with which she claimed them. At one point, he halted, turning to face her fully. The moment was unadorned, absent of witnesses or ceremony. "I once believed that what I could provide defined my worth," he said. "I see now that what I must relinquish may matter more." She regarded him steadily, weighing the statement not as confession but as commitment. "Relinquishment is not an end," she replied. "It is a beginning if it is sincere." He inclined his head, accepting the truth of that distinction. The gesture was small, yet it carried the weight of a renunciation long deferred. He did not reach for her hand. He did not speak of future arrangements or seek assurances. Instead, he offered her the courtesy of choice, trusting that what could not be compelled might yet be freely given. Their meetings continued, unremarkable in form and extraordinary in consequence. Each encounter reinforced the understanding that affection, if it were to grow, must do so without leverage. Eliza allowed herself, cautiously, to recognize the change in him, not as transformation wrought by longing alone but as discipline sustained by respect. The Duke, for his part, learned to value the intervals between their meetings, understanding that anticipation unaccompanied by entitlement sharpened rather than diminished regard. When at last he spoke of love, it was without flourish or demand. The words were offered plainly, as one might offer a truth discovered too late to embellish. He spoke of partnership rather than protection, of admiration earned rather than assumed. He acknowledged the harm done and did not seek to erase it. He asked, simply, whether she could envision a future in which they stood side by side, neither diminished nor exalted by the other. Eliza did not answer at once. She considered the path that had led her there, the resolve forged in humiliation, the strength discovered in departure. She understood that forgiveness was not an obligation but a choice, and that love, if accepted, must not compromise the independence she had claimed. "I will not return to a life shaped by gratitude," she said at last. "Nor will I accept devotion that cannot endure my refusal." He met her gaze without flinching. "Then refuse me if you must," he replied. "I would rather earn your regard than possess it untested." The honesty of the response settled the matter more effectively than any promise could have done. Eliza felt the quiet certainty that had guided her since the night she left Harrington House align with something warmer, more hopeful. She extended her hand, not as surrender but as invitation, allowing the future to remain undefined. Their union, when it came, was marked not by spectacle but by equilibrium. Society observed the change with interest, then acceptance, as it always did when confronted with constancy it could not dislodge. The Duke relinquished nothing of consequence to others, yet he gained what authority alone had never afforded him. Eliza entered the next chapter of her life without erasing the one that had shaped her, carrying forward the knowledge that dignity, once claimed, need not be defended. Those who later spoke of their story often focused on the remark that began it, repeating the insult as though it were the most important thing that had been said. They failed to understand that the true measure of the tale lay not in the cruelty uttered, but in the response it provoked, and in the rare humility that followed. In an age governed by rank and expectation, a woman chose herself, and a man learned, too late and just in time, that love begins where entitlement ends.